You cannot fight them alone. Your wound will tear open.
No, that's suicide. He knows you're with me. He'll expect you to run. He'll follow you and he'll kill you. Let me go.
Please, take them off, she said, and when the rancher opened the sack, what he saw left him speechless. Arizona Territory, 1880. They left her out there to die. Not fast, not loud, just slow and quiet. Like throwing a broken dog out in the heat and waiting for the sun to finish the job. It was July in the Arizona Territory, one of them months where the air don't breathe back. The red rocks of the Navajo country lay still under the kind of sun that makes old wood split and horses go blind if they run too long. Jedediah Stone, 42, had lived through enough hell to know when something wasn't right. He wasn't soft, not after burying a brother, burning a house, and losing a woman who once called him home. But what he saw that day, that ain't the kind of thing a man forgets. She was standing on the edge of his claim, near the dried-out wash he hadn't cleared in years, barefoot, buckskin dress soaked to the knees, a grain sack tied hard over her head, no slits, no mercy, wrists bound, rope cuts deep enough to shame barbed wire. And still, she didn't move, didn't run, didn't scream. She just waited like she already knew no one was coming. Now tell me, you ever seen something so wrong it makes your teeth ache? Jedediah stepped down from his horse. Didn't say a damn word. Just walked slow like a man approaching a cliff edge he couldn't see the bottom of. The girl whispered, voice so dry it cracked mid-syllable. Please, take them off. Not loud, not dramatic, just empty like the words were the last thing she owned. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. Jedediah's fingers, rough from the grip of a rifle and the sting of desert sand, reached up to the knot. It was tied with hate, a twisted piece of cruelty that had no business being in a land that already had enough of its own. It took 3 long, agonizing minutes to undo. When the sack finally fell away, what he saw underneath wasn't cursed. It was 19 years of someone else's cruelty etched into her face, in the hollow of her cheeks, in the haunted stillness of her dark eyes. It was a face that had seen more pain than any man ought to know, much less a woman so young. Her hair, the color of a raven's wing, was tangled and caked with dust. Her skin, the hue of the earth itself, was raw in places where the rope had chafed. It wasn't the kind of beauty a man would write poems about, but it was the kind that gripped your soul and refused to let go. Jedediah didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she came from, or what the hell happened. He just helped her up onto the saddle, real gentle-like, and rode slow back to the cabin. The ride was quiet, but not awkward quiet. More like the kind of silence that shows up when two folks know they've both seen too much. Back at his claim, Jedediah poured her a tin cup of water. She drank it like it hurt, but she didn't spill a drop. He boiled a potato, left her the bigger half. Didn't say why, didn't need to. She sat near the fire, wrapped in one of his old blankets. She didn't speak for nearly 20 minutes. Jedediah didn't push. Hell, pushing ain't never helped nobody open up. Not out here in this unforgiving country. Finally, she looked at him, her voice barely a whisper, a sound softer than the wind through the sagebrush. They said if a man looked too long, he'd get cursed. Jedediah didn't blink. Doesn't sound like a curse. Sounds like cowards. She smiled. Small, crooked, but it was something. It was a flicker of light in a deep, dark well. The next morning, Jedediah found her hanging his shirts on the line. She wasn't asking to stay, but she wasn't asking to leave either. Her movements were slow, deliberate, each action a silent testament to a life spent with purpose, even if that purpose had been broken by others. She walked with a quiet strength, her feet, though sore and cut, finding a rhythm with the hard, baked earth. But word in a town like Fort Apache, a town built on greed and violence, moves faster than a rattler in dry brush. By sundown, the saloons were buzzing with stories. Some said she was Apache. Some said she was a witch. One old drunk even said she was a ghost Jedediah had dug up and fallen in love with. Jedediah didn't give a damn what they thought. He had traps to set, a canteen to fill, and now a woman with rope burns, who flinched every time he coughed too loud. But that evening, things changed. Two men on horseback came up the south trail. Didn't wave, didn't smile, just sat there looking at the cabin like it owed them something. Jedediah stepped onto the porch, his rifle leaning against the door frame. Inside, the woman went still, hands shaking, eyes wide, like she recognized the smell of these men without even seeing them. They hadn't come to say hi, and Jedediah knew if they were here now, more would follow. He didn't recognize the two men, but he knew the type. Too clean for ranch hands, too quiet for travelers, and they sat their saddles like men who thought they owned whatever they looked at. The taller one, with a cruel twist to his thin lips, tipped his hat. "Looking for a girl," he said. "Navajo, red bead on her wrist." Jedediah didn't blink. "Haven't seen her." The other one laughed, a low, rasping sound. "She limps a little. Pretty, if you can get past the quiet inside." The woman was holding her breath. Her hands gripped the edge of the table like it might float her away. Jedediah stepped down off the porch. Real calm. "She ain't here. You can ride on." "Thing is," the first man said, his voice dropping, "she ain't yours to keep." That did it. Jedediah's voice dropped low, but it hit like thunder. "She ain't anyone's to keep. She's not cattle. She's not property. She's a person." The men didn't push further. Not yet. They turned their horses and rode off. But the way they looked back told Jedediah one thing clear as day. They weren't done. That night the woman didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just sat by the fire, a small, worn piece of turquoise clutched in her hand. Funny thing about stones, they always seem to show up when you need them most. She looked at Jedediah, her voice barely there. "They'll come back, maybe," he said. The next morning, she wasn't hiding. She was walking the perimeter of Jedediah's claim in his old boots, shirt tucked in like she belonged. And when he asked if she wanted to stay, she didn't say yes. She just said, "I'm tired of running. Now, I'll tell you something. If you followed this story this far, you're the kind of person who believes people can change, who believes maybe the West didn't kill all the kindness after all. And if that's you, you might want to stick around, 'cause the worst part of this story, the part that still haunts folks in the Arizona territory, it's coming up next. So go on, hit that little subscribe button and don't miss how this ends. But trust me, it's worth the wait. They came back on the third night. Not two this time. 4. 4 shadows pressing down on the land like vultures circling carrion, as if the desert itself had given them permission to crawl out of its belly. No lanterns lit their way. No greeting carried on the air, just the dull, deliberate rhythm of hooves beating against the packed earth. Slow and heavy, the way men ride when they have no fear of the dark. Jedediah heard them long before they reached the gate. He always did. He had slept for too many years with one ear open, listening for sounds that might mean life or death. In that lonely stretch of country, silence was never safe. It was just the pause before something broke. He stepped outside with the rifle resting in his hands. He didn't raise it. Didn't need to. Not yet. His stillness was the stillness of a man who had seen death before and wasn't afraid to measure it again. The leader slid off his horse first. Calhoun Hayes. Folks called him the Vulture, a name that clung to him like rot to bone. His reputation was stitched into whispers along every border town. Girls vanished like dust on the wind, card games fixed, whiskey debts left unpaid. He was a man whose legacy was nothing but broken promises and broken bodies, a man who carried ruin with him the way other men carried a gun. He spat into the dirt, the sound harsh in the midnight quiet. "She belongs to the man who paid," Calhoun said, his voice rough, cruel, like gravel dragged across iron. Jedediah didn't flinch. His eyes were pale and steady. "She's not property," Calhoun smirked, stepping closer, his boots sinking into the dust with a predator's certainty. "She's a curse, old man, a Navajo curse you'll wish you never laid eyes on." Inside the cabin, she heard every word. But this time, she did not shrink back into the dark, did not fold herself behind blankets or hide in corners. The fear that had once owned her seemed to have burned away, leaving only something raw and unyielding. She opened the door barefoot, the wood cold beneath her soles. She was wrapped in Jedediah's old quilt, the edges frayed but warm, and in her hand she held a small polished stone, smooth and shining faintly in the firelight. Her eyes dark, steady, ancient with grief, fixed on Calhoun like arrows, aimed straight into his marrow. "You afraid of me?" she asked, her voice low, humming with strength, carrying a rhythm older than the desert wind. The other men shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. For a moment, the silence deepened, thick and uneasy. Calhoun took half a step back before catching himself, a flicker of surprise flashing across his eyes, gone as quickly as it came. "You beat me," she said, her voice rising, the words trembling like arrows drawn to a bow. "You sold me. You left me bleeding in the dirt. You said I'd bring ruin, but look who's shaking now." Her gaze was unbroken, unwavering, the gaze of a hawk circling its prey. Jedediah raised the rifle, calm as a sunrise, no tremor in his hands, no quiver in his breath. "You'll ride out now," he said. "And if I see you near this claim again, you won't ride out at all." The threat was not shouted. It was spoken as a promise, carved into the silence like scripture. And the men, rough riders hardened by blood and dust, did not argue, did not spit back curses. They turned their horses without a word and disappeared into the night, swallowed by the desert that had birthed them. When they were gone, she sat down on the porch steps, her body trembling not with fear but with release. She did not cry. She only breathed slow, uneven breaths, like a woman who hadn't truly drawn air into her lungs in years. Jedediah sat beside her. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Silence was their language, and for once it wasn't heavy. It was shared. After that night, the land grew quiet. Not the brittle quiet of fear, but the soft, earned quiet that comes after storms pass and nothing breaks anymore. She no longer hid. She no longer flinched when wind rattled the shutters. At dawn, she walked the arid fence lines barefoot, wrapped in light, as if she owned the sun itself. Jedediah never asked her why, never tried to name what was changing in her. He only watched, the way a man watches something broken slowly knit itself back together. He knew he was witnessing a kind of healing, the sort that only time and courage could shape. A month passed, then two. The woman's name, now spoken freely in the cabin, was Ayanna. Slowly, in fragments like pieces of shattered pottery being set back together, she began to tell her story. Not long speeches, not complete histories, just fragments, enough to make the silence less heavy. She told him of her people, the Diné, the Navajo. She spoke of the long walk, of the soldiers who drove her family from their land, of the endless miles and the endless hunger, of how her people were torn apart until even their songs sounded broken. She told him of the gambler in Fort Apache, the one who had bought her, and of Calhoun, the man who had sold her, who treated souls like currency. Jedediah listened, his weathered face unmoving, but his eyes betrayed him. They carried the weight of her words like stones laid upon stones. He had been a bounty hunter once. He had never traded in lives, but he had seen the aftermath. He had seen children left orphaned, women left hollow, men reduced to shadows of themselves. He had never been a hero, never pretended to be only a man who did a job for money. But for the first time in many long years, he felt something that had nothing to do with a reward poster or a payday. He felt a purpose. He found himself not just protecting her, but opening pieces of himself he thought had long since turned to ash. He told her, in the low firelit hours, of the brother he had lost in the war, of the woman he had once loved, a woman taken too soon by fever. His words were halting, as though dragged up from places he had buried them deep, but he spoke them because she listened. Their voices, his and hers, were like two slow rivers, carving through dry earth, finding one another, merging into something stronger. Then, one afternoon while they were checking traps in the far reaches of the canyon, they saw it, a lone rider on the horizon. Just one, not two men, not four, not Calhoun's pack. Jedediah's hand went instantly to the rifle, the instinct of a man who trusted nothing that moved toward him from the desert. "Might be Calhoun," he said, his voice low, rough as the grit in his throat. Ayanna shook her head, eyes narrowing against the glare. "Number not him." The rider drew closer, When he finally dismounted, Jedediah saw he was no older than 20, thin as hunger, his clothes worn through, his face carved with exhaustion. His eyes found Ayanna first. "My name is Ha-Na-He," he said in the Navajo tongue, his voice breaking on the words. "I was with your family. We were scattered. I was told you were gone." Ayanna did not cry. She only reached out, her hand trembling as it touched his, a silent confirmation that neither of them were ghosts. From his saddlebag, he pulled a map crudely drawn on a piece of hide, the ink smeared but clear enough. It showed where some of their people had been forced to settle, where fragments of families tried to hold themselves together. He spoke of the long miles, of hunger that gnawed through bone, of hope carried like embers in the dark. Jedediah said nothing. He only led the boy back to the cabin. They sat by the fire that night, 3 shadows stitched together by grief and memory. A new plan began to form, not vengeance, not yet, but survival. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen, not just for Ayanna, but for all her people. They didn't have to run anymore. They had to fight. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from, so I don't feel so alone out here. The young man, Ha-Na-He, stayed for only a few days, yet in those days the cabin seemed to breathe differently. His presence carried the weight of generations, a quiet comfort stitched into the silence that had once suffocated the place. He spoke little at first, his words careful, deliberate. But when he did speak, it was of the desert, its cruel sun, its secret wells, the veins of water hidden beneath the rocks like promises meant only for those who knew where to look. He told of the old ways, of stories older than the wind, of spirits who guarded the canyons and wept when the people were scattered. Jedediah listened. For a man who had built his life on hardness, on the trigger of a gun, on the cold transaction of bounty and blood, it was strange to feel reverence rise in him like an unfamiliar prayer. He did not see just a boy sitting before the fire. He saw the last flicker of a flame that men like Calhoun Hayes had tried so long to smother. And in Ha-Na-He's eyes, weary and unbroken, he saw the same fierce spirit that had taken root in Ayanna, the spirit that refused to die even when everything else had been stolen. But comfort never came without cost. The boy's words carried not only memory but warning. He spoke of Calhoun the vulture and the pack of men who now hunted the remnants of his people. He told of land stripped bare, of belongings stolen, of families driven farther and farther until only shadows remained. He spoke of a hidden canyon, a fragile refuge where some Navajo had gathered, a place meant to be sanctuary yet doomed to become a grave if Calhoun ever found it. The weight of it pressed against the cabin walls like a storm threatening to split the sky. Jedediah felt it in his bones, the old familiar dread of violence on the horizon, the knowledge that a fight was coming and that it would cost more than he could ever give. Ayanna's heart twisted. She longed to run to her people, to guide them, to whisper of new paths and safer ground. But she knew the truth. Every step she took could be a beacon leading Calhoun straight to them. She stood in a terrible place, torn between duty and fear, between the blood she carried and the life she had begun to rebuild. She was no longer merely a victim. The days of hiding beneath quilts, of trembling at every sound, had fallen away. Now the burden of choice pressed down on her shoulders, heavy as stone. Protect her people or stay and fight, risking everything. One afternoon, while scouting the ridge with Jedediah, they found an old Navajo signal, a strip of cloth tied to the branches of a juniper tree. It fluttered weakly in the wind, but its meaning struck with the force of thunder. Danger. Ayanna's heart sank. Her lips parted in a soundless gasp. Calhoun had found the canyon. He was closer than either of them had dared to believe. The clock was no longer ticking, it was tolling, loud and merciless. They had no more time. Jedediah, though steady on his feet, was still weak. The wound from the earlier fight gnawed at him like fire in his side. The fever had broken, but it had left him hollow, his arms sluggish, his strength frayed. Still, he stood tall, his jaw clenched, as if defiance itself were the only medicine he needed. "You cannot fight them alone," Ayana whispered, her voice sharp with fear, with desperate urgency. "Your wound will tear open. You will not last. Let me go. I can draw them away." Her eyes pleaded, shining dark with a courage born of sorrow. Jedediah shook his head slowly, his face carved with grim resolve. That's suicide. He knows you're with me. He'll expect you to run. He'll follow you, and he'll kill you. That's not a gamble I'll make." He paused, his breath ragged. "He wants us both, but I'm the one he truly wants to break." The words hung between them like the toll of a bell. A plan began to take shape, desperate, fragile, built not on hope, but on trust and sacrifice. Jedediah would draw Calhoun away, standing in the open as bait. Ayana would use the distraction to slip into the canyon, to send warning, to scatter her people before the slaughter could come. It was a plan that had no guarantee, a plan that smelled of death, but it was the only one. That evening, as the sun bled itself into the horizon, Jedediah pressed his rifle into Ayana's hands. "You'll need this," he said. The steel was cold, heavy as fate. Ayana hesitated, her fingers trembling as they closed around it. The weight was not just iron, it was promise, it was responsibility, it was the echo of every soul who had been silenced. She nodded once, though her heart shuddered inside her chest. Then they saw them. Calhoun and his men appeared on the ridge, their figures dark against the last light of the dying sun. Shadows stretched long behind them like carrion wing. Jedediah stepped into the open, his body small against the vast canyon, but unshaken. His hand rested on the pistol at his side. Calhoun's laugh rang out, cruel and echoing, the sound of a graveyard rattling its chains. "So, the bounty hunter wants to play hero." His voice dripped poison. "Where's the curse, old man? Did she finally leave you to rot?" Jedediah answered with silence. Then, with the slow grace of inevitability, he drew his pistol. It was a challenge older than words. The gunfight came quick, brutal, merciless. Jedediah was a marksman honed by years of blood and survival. He dropped one man with a single shot. Dust exploded around them, the air torn with thunder, but he was 1 against 4. A shot ripped through his side, the impact slamming him to the ground. His breath caught, sharp and wet, vision swimming with red. Calhoun dismounted with deliberate cruelty, his boots striking the earth like nails driven into a coffin. His grin was wide, gleaming with triumph. He kicked Jedediah's pistol into the dust. "You should have stayed out of this," he sneered. "You had your chance to die quiet, to live with your ghosts. But you had to play a man of honor, didn't you?" He crouched low, his face twisted with glee. "And honor don't get you far out here." His laugh was jagged, broken glass against bone. They bound Jedediah, tying him like an animal to the back of a horse. His head sagged, blood dripping into the dirt, but his eyes still burned with defiance. From the shadows, Ayana watched. Her heart had become a stone, heavy and cold, refusing to break though every nerve screamed with grief. She saw the cruelty in Calhoun's face, the hunger not just to kill but to unmake a man. Jedediah had stood for her people. He had offered himself as the wall between survival and ruin, and now he was shackled, dragged into the darkness like a prize. She had a choice. She could run, as he had begged her to, carrying his sacrifice like a burden, vanishing into the wild with her people. Or she could follow, rifle in hand, and fight a war not of numbers but of spirit, a war of vengeance, a war of honor. The hunter had become the hunted. The prey had become the warrior. Ayana's grip tightened on the rifle, the cold steel biting into her palms. Its weight was no longer foreign. It was a promise. She would not let him die. Not alone. Not like this. Ayana followed their trail, her movements as silent as a snake threading through the sand. Every step was deliberate, every pause heavy with breath. She did not dare release too quickly. The Arizona night was cruel. Black sky stretched endless, stars cutting like shards of ice, and wind carrying with it the voices of the dead. Yet this merciless land was her ally. The jagged canyons shielded her, the dry washes swallowed her tracks, and the very silence that once had frightened her now cloaked her like a mother's arm. The knowledge of her ancestors pulsed in her veins. She remembered the whispers of her grandmother, the rituals of her people, the way the desert gave if you knew how to ask. For centuries the Dainay had endured, and though soldiers had torn them from their homelands, though Calhoun Hayes had sold and beaten her, the desert still remembered her. She was no longer a shadow trembling in fear. She was not prey, not anymore. She was the hunter, and her prey, Calhoun and the vultures who rode with him, had no idea how close death already walked behind them. She studied them as they moved, saw the arrogance in their posture, the careless laughter when they believed no eyes watched. They thought the desert was theirs, that no woman, no curse, would dare follow them into the heart of the wilderness they claimed. That arrogance would be their undoing. Night was her weapon. In darkness, her people had survived raids, soldiers, and starvation. In darkness, she would take back what was hers. She had seen their camps, how the men placed their sentries, how careless they grew once whiskey touched their lips. She would use their confidence as a blade against them. Jedediah's rifle lay heavy at her back, but she did not raise it. Its crack would betray her, echoing through stone like a drumbeat announcing her presence. Instead, she chose the bow she had shaped herself. Arrows tipped sharp, each one a silent whisper of retribution. With ghost-like grace she moved, the desert winds covering her steps, her breath a prayer between earth and sky. The first arrow found its mark with a hiss, sliding through the night into the chest of a sentry who never even gasped. Another fell before he could sound the alarm, clutching at his throat as if trying to hold the life from spilling out. She melted into the shadows again, watching the panic ripple through camp. The men muttered of spirits, of a Navajo ghost come to hunt them. Fear grew like wildfire, hotter than the desert sun. She fed that fear, one arrow at a time, until the whisper of her name, Ayanna, no longer belonged to flesh and blood but to something spectral, something inevitable. Calhoun's arrogance soured into rage. His curses cracked across the canyon walls, his face twisting as his men dwindled. Fear, she knew, was more deadly than any blade, and now it was eating him alive. At last she found him. Jedediah was bound to a stake in the dry bed of a river long dead, the moon casting him in pale shadow. His face was swollen, purple with bruises, blood crusted along his temple. One arm hung at a grotesque angle, broken. Yet even beaten, his eyes still carried fire. And over him stood Calhoun Hayes, knife glinting cruel in his hand. He leaned close, voice a serpent's hiss. "Look at you, Jedediah, a man of honor." He spat the word like poison. "And for what? For a savage girl you thought worth saving?" His laughter was hollow, echoing across rock-like bones rattling. "There's no honor out here, old man. There's only what you take." Ayanna's chest ached as though the knife had cut her instead, but she did not reveal herself. Not yet. Patience was survival. Patience was justice. She crouched among the rocks, eyes fixed, waiting for the moment when the wind itself seemed to hold its breath. The remaining men clustered around a fire, their backs turned, their shoulders sagging with weariness. She drew in one deep breath, nocked an arrow, and let it fly. The cry was sharp and immediate. A man clutched his shoulder, tumbling forward into the flames, scattering sparks. Chaos roared alive, shouts, confusion, scrambling boots. Calhoun spun toward the noise, his fury splitting the night. That was the moment. Ayanna emerged, no longer shadow but flesh and vengeance. She did not cry out. Her silence was louder than any war song. She moved in a blur, seized Jedediah's knife where it had been tossed aside, and in one swift, brutal cut, severed the ropes that bound him. Calhoun's roar split the sky. "The curse!" he screamed, spittle flying. He fumbled for his pistol, rage blinding him. Jedediah, weak and broken, lunged for his fallen gun, his body screaming in pain but his spirit refusing surrender. Yet when his hand closed around the weapon, he looked up and Ayanna saw the raw, burning fire in her eyes. This was her battle. She was no longer the woman he had rescued. She was the warrior who would save them both. He understood without words, and he did not raise his gun. He trusted her. The last of Calhoun's men writhed on the ground, moaning, arrows in their flesh. Only the vulture himself remained, eyes wild, breath ragged. He raised his gun, but Ayanna was faster. She moved with the swiftness of wind sweeping the canyon, her body one with the desert's pulse. His shot rang out, the bullet grazing past her, close enough to tear fabric but not flesh. For the first time she saw him clearly, not the monster she had painted in her nightmares, but a coward. A man who built his life on suffering, who clothed himself in cruelty because inside he was hollow. She had him. She could end it. But vengeance was not what this moment demanded. It was justice. True victory was not in blood spilled, but in stripping him of the power he believed eternal. Her voice rang steady, sharp as obsidian. "It is over. You have no power here." Something broke in his face, a mask torn away. His gun fell from his hand, clattering against stone. He looked from Jedediah, broken but unbent, to Ayanna, radiant with unshakable will. In their eyes, he saw not hatred but something far worse. Strength beyond his reach, a strength born of honor. Honor, the one thing he could never buy, never steal, never kill. Calhoun Hayes, the vulture, was left with nothing. They disarmed him and turned away, leaving him where the desert would decide his fate. Alone, stripped of his men, his guns, his power, he was more broken than if they had buried him. Death would have been mercy. This was worse. Ayanna slipped her arm beneath Jedediah's, helping him to his feet. His body was a map of scars, old and new, but his spirit stood tall. The night air was cool on their skin, and for the first time she felt her past lift, not vanish, but loosen, as if she had finally exhaled the breath she had been holding since the first blow, the first betrayal. They walked away together, silhouettes against the paling dawn. No longer just a wounded man and a scarred woman. They were something more. They were proof that even in the darkest corners of the wild, where cruelty reigned and honor was mocked, courage could endure. Love could endure, and honor, the kind born of sacrifice and sorrow, could still prevail. They moved beneath the pale silver of the moon, its light spilling across the desert like a veil of mercy. Jedediah's arm hung heavy over Ayanna's shoulder, each step grinding his strength down to its last reserves. His face was carved with pain, every line a testament to years of violence, regrets, and the fresh agony of wounds not yet healed. But in his eyes, those weathered, storm-gray eyes, there was something softer now, something he had not carried in a long, long time. Peace. He was not a bounty hunter anymore. Not a man whose worth was counted by dollars on a poster or the number of bodies left in his wake. That old self had bled out with the dust and bullets. Tonight, he was something else, simply a man who had fought for something real, something more lasting than money or reputation. He had fought for honor, he had fought for justice, and most of all, he had fought for the woman who walked beside him, steady as the earth beneath their feet. And Ayanna, she was no longer a victim of cruelty, no longer a shadow cowering in the corners of a stranger's cabin. The shackles of her past had fallen away, not broken by the hand of any savior, but shattered by her own strength. She had faced the vulture himself, looked into the hollow eyes of the man who had once sold her, and she had risen not as prey, but as the hawk who soared above him. She was free, not because Jedediah had freed her, but because she had found the courage to free herself. The journey to the canyon was long, their bodies worn by the desert, but they pressed forward until at last the cliffs opened into a hidden world. Red rock walls rose on either side, holding the air still, almost reverent, as though the canyon itself understood the weight of the moment. It was a secret refuge, carved by time, guarded by ancient whispers of her people. And there, huddled in the heart of it, were the survivors, a small, weary band of Navajo, their faces carved with the same lines of suffering Ayanna carried, but their eyes still alive with the stubbornness of those who refused to vanish. Old men bent with years of hardship, women whose strength was measured in silence, children whose laughter had been stolen but not entirely lost. When they saw her, their breath caught, their expressions shifted, shock breaking into joy, disbelief melting into tears. They had thought her gone forever, another name lost to the cruel ledger of history. And now here she stood, alive, fierce, no longer the girl torn from them, but a woman returned. Ha-na-hey rushed forward, his young face alight with admiration. with relief. His voice cracked as he called her name, and she folded him into her arms, a sister's embrace binding together the fragments of a broken family. Jedediah watched the reunion from the edge, his battered body leaning against a rock for balance. For the first time in years, he felt something he had forgotten how to name: peace. He had carried blood on his hands, guilt on his shoulders, and ghosts in his heart. But here, seeing Ayanna restored to her people, he felt as though he had finally repaid a debt not to her alone, but to a world that had always been broken and cruel. In giving her back to them, he had found his own redemption. If you've made it this far, Jedediah thought, his heart heavy yet alive, then you understand what it means to walk through darkness searching for a single flame. And here's where I, your storyteller, turn to you. If you're still with me, I know you're a true fan of Wild West love. From my heart, I wish your day is filled with health, peace, and maybe a little stroke of luck in the next 15 minutes. If you believe, even in your hardest nights, that God is quietly arranging blessings for you, write Amen in the comments. Because sometimes, the moment you put that word into the world, the blessing finds its way back to you. The days that followed blurred together like smoke rising from a fire. Healing became the rhythm of their lives. The Navajo medicine woman, old as the canyon stones themselves, tended Jedediah's wound with herbs that smelled of earth after rain, and chants that vibrated through the air like low thunder. She told Ayanna that his spirit was strong, that a man who carried no greed in his heart would heal as swiftly as the desert after a storm. And she was right. Though the pain lingered, Jedediah's strength returned little by little, each sunrise knitting flesh and bone, as if the desert itself had chosen to spare him. Through it all, Ayanna never left his side. She was his quiet anchor, her presence steady, her silence speaking more than any words. Their love did not blaze into being like wildfire. It was slower, deeper, a coal glowing in the ashes, a warmth that endured through cold nights. It was not made of passion shouted to the sky, but of the smallest acts of care. A hand steadying his when it trembled, a smile softening the dark, a word whispered in the language of her people. It was, in truth, the truest kind of Wild West love story. Weeks passed, then months. Jedediah's wound closed, his spirit steadied. He taught the young men among the Navajo how to hold a rifle not to kill for coin, but to defend their families, to stand when the vultures came circling again. Ayanna, in turn, taught him the desert, the stars that pointed to water, the way the wind carried warnings, the silent language of tracks pressed into the dust. Together, they became halves of a whole. Two worlds once destined to clash, now bound in harmony. One afternoon, they stood at the canyon's edge, side by side, looking out over the wide, unforgiving expanse of the desert. The sun was sinking, bleeding orange and purple into the horizon, painting the sky with fire and bruises. The wind brushed against their faces like a gentle hand, a promise of beginnings not yet written. Jedediah turned, his voice rough, the question trembling on his lips. What do we do now? Do we stay here? Build a life with your people? For a long moment, Ayanna said nothing. She let the silence speak, let the horizon breathe. Then she smiled a smile that was no longer shadowed by sorrow, no longer small or hesitant, but full, radiant, alive. My people have their home, she said softly. They have their history, and I will always belong to them. But we have a road of our own to walk. Her eyes, dark as night, but bright with unshaken hope, lifted to the endless horizon. The desert is wide, Jedediah. The horizon is endless. We are free. We can go anywhere. She mounted her Mustang, the sturdy creature pawing at the ground as if it too longed for the open trail. Jedediah followed, his movements slow but sure. For the first time in decades, he did not need a map, a bounty, or a destination. He had purpose enough. They rode into the twilight, not toward a plan, not toward riches, but toward freedom. And in that moment, beneath the bruised sky of the Wild West, they were no longer just survivors. They were proof that even in the harshest deserts, love could take root, that honor could outlive cruelty, that broken souls could stitch themselves together not in spite of pain, but because of it. Their journey was only beginning. It was not an ending at all, but a promise, a cowboy love story born of ashes and grief, transformed into something wide and eternal, a Wild West love not of destination, but of the road itself. Theirs, forever. Today's story is about pains that seemed to have no way out until a small ray of light changed everything. Do you believe that, even in the darkest times, there's always a miracle waiting at the end of the road? And if deep down you still believe that God is watching over you, quietly arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment, Amen, below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write it, a blessing may quietly find its way into your life.